In the summer of 1999, I was less than a year serving my first church out of seminary, and I was feeling all grown up and ready to take on the world in ministry, but also I was starting to feel ready to settle down a little bit and put down some roots. I'd been married to Colin's mother, Dawn, for 5 years, and in that time, those first 5 years, we had already made 3 major moves in our life. And if any of you have ever moved, you know how awful one move can be. We had made 3 moves in a 5-year period. The first was from Georgia to North Carolina so I could finish college. The second was from North Carolina back to Atlanta so I could begin seminary. And then the third was to move from Atlanta, where I was in seminary, to Watkinsville, Georgia, just outside of Athens, where my first congregation was. And actually, when I think about it, while I was in seminary, we moved twice. We were in a 1-bedroom apartment, and then we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. For the first 9 months of our time together in this community, we rented a home, but then came that all-important grown-up decision, buying a house for the first time. So in the summer of 1999, we bought our first home. And for those keeping track now, that actually adds up to 5 moves in a 5-year period, which is a lot. But it's also the life of a young preacher. We found this cute little house in an established neighborhood that had a lot of trees in it. And it was a neighborhood where the homes were not too close together, but were close enough where you didn't feel isolated. So there we were, Colin's mom, me, our cat Smokey, and our yellow lab Dwayne, named after Dwayne Allman. Now, Dwayne is an important part of this story because at that time, Dwayne, the yellow lab, was still a puppy. He was less than a year old. He was all legs, all head. He was totally goofy, and he loved to run and bark as puppies do. So the first thing we did as we moved into this new home was to install a privacy fence in our yard to keep Dwayne from roaming the neighborhood, because that's what good neighbors and responsible pet owners do. But a privacy fence does not keep a dog from barking. And labs, as you may know, can have a deep and loud bark. Not long after we moved in, I met my neighbor across the street. He was in his late 40s, overweight, balding, and grumpy. So just to tie it all together, in 1999, I met my future self, living across the street from me, and my 1999 self. I don't remember his name, but I do remember his face, his house, his yard, and his attitude. From the outside, his house and his yard were meticulous. He kept it up perfectly. His front yard was Georgia sod, and every weekend he would sit on top of his 1970s red snapper riding lawnmower, the kind that my family had and that I would use as a kid cutting grass, and he would go back and forth in that front yard in perfect lines, cutting the grass at a whopping speed of 3/4 of 1 mile an hour. I was working in my front yard one day when my neighbor, who I will refer to from now on as Mr. Snapper, came out of his garage and started yelling at me. The first words out of his mouth that day, and possibly the very first words he ever said to me in the time that we had lived there, were these: "You need to shut that blankety-blank dog up. All he ever does is bark." I swear I would not have been surprised if he came out and said, "Get off my lawn." But I wasn't on his lawn. So did I mention how charming he was? "Excuse me," I said. "Your dog He needs to shut up, and you need to do something about it. I'm sick and tired of it. And I explained to Mr. Snapper that I was working with Dwayne and his barking, that he was still a puppy, that he was still learning. I also told him that I had regrettably purchased one of those anti-barking collars to put on your dog that tries to keep them from barking as a deterrent, and none of this seemed to appease Mr. Snapper. So by this time, he was standing at the end of his driveway. I was standing at the end of my driveway. The only thing separating us was the street in which we both called home. And then he finally said something to me that ever since that day has influenced the way that I view God, the way that I view the church, the way that I view society, and yes, the way I view culture. This is not a parable, by the way. This is a true story. Colin, this happened before you were born. He said to me, I have been living in this neighborhood from the beginning. I have been here for 13 years, and you have only been here a few months. You need to shut that dog up. To which I said, so what? That I mentioned that I too have been this charming all this time. It was at that point that Mr. Snapper's face turned as red as his little lawnmower. What did you say? I said, so what? I said, just because you have lived here longer than I have does not mean that you have any more rights than I do. I'm not the only one on this street with a dog. I'm not the only one on the street who has a dog that barks. My other neighbors next door also had dogs that bark. I said, how long you have lived here does not instill you with more rights than I or anyone else. We are both equal parts of this community and this neighborhood. And the moment that I moved in, I had the exact same number of rights that you did. Now, that may not have been the most tactful thing, but it is the truth. And it applies to neighborhoods, apartment complexes, churches, you name it. It doesn't matter how long you have been a part of something, that we together are a part of the same community. Now, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. But I'm pretty sure that Jesus had never met Mr. Snapper. Loving our neighbor is hard. It is hard, hard, hard work. And I'm not just talking about the person who lives next door or across the street. In Luke's gospel, Jesus helps us to understand our neighbor better by broadening our understanding and the definition of the term. Our neighbor, says Jesus, includes our enemies. The person or people whose presence or whose belief or whose identity challenge us and even offends us, that too is our neighbor. The person about whom we say, oh, I love them, but only because Jesus tells me that I have to. Which, by the way, is not a faithful application of the love commandment. I do it, I love them, but I only love them because Jesus tells me to. That is about as sincere as it sounds, and it's even less faithful. But while we are grateful for Luke's expansion of our understanding, we also have to recognize that this text that Fred read just a little while ago, it's not Luke's story, it's Matthew's story. There's no extra parable here to help us understand what Jesus is saying. There is simply instruction. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And the phrasing of that question by the lawyer is essential. Which commandment in the law? In the law of Moses. Which commandment in the law is the greatest? The law of Moses, the law that is essential to the life of the Jewish people. And Matthew's audience, Matthew's church, to whom he is writing and giving testimony about this person named Jesus, is also a very Jewish audience that embraces and thoroughly lives every aspect of Jewish tradition. So when they hear the question of the lawyer, when they read the question of the lawyer, they immediately perk up. They perk up to hear how Jesus is going to answer the question, because how he answers which law is the greatest, which commandment in the law is the greatest, how he answers that question will speak to his credibility. And it will say to the listener, to the member of Matthew's community, is this Jesus someone we should also follow? It all depends upon how he answers the question. The answer is simple, says Jesus. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul. Bingo. Jesus passed the test. He quotes directly from the Torah, the book of Moses, Deuteronomy 6. Now in Deuteronomy 5, we have another account of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God, and immediately upon presenting them to the Israelite people, Moses, speaking on behalf of God, clearly states, now listen, these are 10, but here is the one that is most important. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. This is called, in the Jewish tradition, the Shema, which is the centerpiece of Jewish life, worship life, prayer life, morning and evening prayer services. And it continues. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away and when you lie down and when you are awake. Bind them as a sign on your hand and fix them as an emblem on your forehead. And write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. This is how important the command to love God is. It should be a constant part of every ounce of ourself and our being and our way of living. And then Jesus throws the audience a curveball, because he makes an addendum. Yes, loving God is most important, but then Jesus does the one thing anyone who has ever read Scripture hates. Jesus quotes Leviticus. Quoting Leviticus never seems to go well. But Jesus pulls it off. He pulls it off by connecting to the Shema some of the fine print that is found within the covenant between God and Israel. Leviticus 19:18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Love God. Love neighbor. Without commentary. They are equally as important. Don't hold a grudge. Now, if we took that as seriously, biblically, and theologically as we did love of God, just imagine how powerful, how graceful, how beautiful, how wonderful life could be. Jesus meshes together two laws, two commands into one and 1A. Now also, included in the Leviticus narrative, and I think that this is implied, included, and connected to Jesus' highlight to love. There's this little gem just a few verses later in chapter 19 of Leviticus. And it says, when an alien or a foreigner resides in your land, you shall not oppress the alien or the foreigner. The alien and the foreigner who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien, the foreigner, the immigrant, the refugee as yourself. For you were aliens and the foreigners, refugees in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Love God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the foreigner as yourself. We don't always include those three things together. But you know what? They can't be separated. You cannot claim love. You cannot claim that you love God if you do not have love for the guy next door who either yells at you or who responds to you in a smart aleck tone. You can't claim you love God if you don't have love for the Syrian refugee, the Muslim from Afghanistan or Iraq, or the family who crossed the border from Mexico. And I don't mean love by saying, I love them because Jesus tells me I have to. I mean love in word and in deed and in actions and in behaviors and in attitudes and in policy. All of this calls us to examine our relationships as children of God, how we relate to one another, how we live together as community, how we exhibit faithful stewardship. Because make no mistake about it, faithful stewardship begins with loving relationships, whether it be with our money or our time or our gifts or other people. Years ago in my ministry, about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I began speaking about the stewardship of one another's presence. How do we exhibit faithful stewardship of those around us? Those we come into contact with on a daily basis, and even those we don't come into contact with, but whose presence we are aware of. People. God's people. People created in God's image and likeness and who have within them a part of the divine and holy presence of God. Because the people who are placed in our lives, all people, even if not especially the ones who challenge us, they are a gift. They are a gift from God, which right there is the reason to love them. Because to love one another is to love the God within them. And to love God is to love the person within whom God resides. Good stewardship of one another's presence is a stewardship of love. Never to be taken for granted, never to be taken advantage of, never to use for one's own personal gain, never to be used to exploit. Stewardship, faithful stewardship, is grounded in love. And love is grounded in the stewardship of presence. God's presence and one another's presence. And I think, actually I know that all of us sitting here in this place today and those who are not sitting in this place today with us. We all know and have experienced the redeeming power of love before. And we know how it can change us. We know how it can challenge us. We know how it can transform us. By the time I moved out of Windy Creek Drive, Colin was just about a year old. Mr. Snapper had found himself a lady friend, and he seemed so much happier. She was a kind woman. She was sweet, and she was smiling, and she was waving when I saw them working together in the yard. And I think I actually saw him smile a time or two. He even let her ride his lawnmower, which where I come from is a sign of deep, deep love.